The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song above the Seattle General night shift, a frequency that existed just below human hearing but never quite left your skull once you'd worked 8 months under them. Sarah Chen moved through the corridors with a kind of invisible competence that made her easy to overlook. No noise, no questions, no needs. Just a nurse checking vitals on the 3rd floor at 2:13 a.m., touching the folded flag in her locker before the shift began, the same ritual every night since she'd arrived in Colorado Springs. The flag was Army issue, tri-folded into a triangle, the creases sharp enough to cut. She didn't touch it for luck. She touched it to remember that people died so she could pretend to be ordinary. Room 347 was where Sergeant Marcus Webb slept in post-surgical recovery, his chart clipped to the foot rail, his vitals stable but fragile. Double amputee. IED blast in San Juan Valley, Helmand Province, 3 weeks ago. Arrived at Seattle General on a Friday. She'd recognized him the moment the ambulance doors opened, not from his face, but from the way the orderlies moved him, the specific silence that followed catastrophic trauma. She'd been the trauma nurse who'd triaged him during intake, her hand steady as surgical lasers, her voice level when she rattled off his vitals to the receiving physician. BP 118/76. Pulse 94. O2 sat 98 on room air. GCS 15. Alert and oriented ×4. The receiving doctor hadn't looked at her hands. Nobody ever did. Webb was dreaming when she checked his foresight. The bag of normal saline would need replacing in 40 minutes, and his morphine pump was showing 16 milligrams remaining in the reservoir. She made a note on his chart, her handwriting precise as a draftsman's blueprint, then moved to the vital signs monitor to log his latest numbers into the system. Everything charted. Everything documented. Everything invisible. That was the assignment, after all. 8 months embedded in Seattle General's night shift, watching supply chains, tracking anomalies, keeping her mouth shut. The Pentagon's version of a ghost. Except ghosts didn't have a daughter who needed a mother at home by 7 a.m., and ghosts didn't feel the weight of that folded flag the way Sarah did every single shift. She'd placed her daughter's lunchbox on the kitchen table this morning before the sun came up. PB&J on whole wheat. Baby carrots. A note in her handwriting, "You are braver than you believe. Mom." The girl was 7. Sarah had opened her own lunchbox once, 8 years ago in a different life, and found a note from her mother that said the exact same thing. Her mother was dead now. Blown up by an IED in Kandahar while saving a medic who'd replaced her during a rotation. Her name was Captain Eleanor Chen. Everyone called her Reaper 6. Nobody at Seattle General knew that. Sarah finished her rounds on the 3rd floor at 3:22 a.m. and headed down to the nurse's station to update the overnight supervisor. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and industrial-grade coffee, a combination she'd learned to breathe without noticing after the first month. Her scrubs were navy blue, loose enough to hide the muscle that running 3 miles every morning before her daughter woke up had left on her frame. Her badge was standard issue, her photograph, her RN credentials, her name in serif font, Chen, MSN. The badge had been issued 8 months ago. It was a very convincing forgery. Dr. James Pierce was waiting at the nurse's station when she arrived, his white coat pressed with a kind of precision that suggested he had someone else press it. He was reviewing the night's charts, his jaw working as if he'd just swallowed something bitter. He looked up when he heard her approach, his eyes moving from her feet to her face with the kind of lazy assessment he gave to his staff, a measurement of utility, not a greeting. "Nurse Chen," he said. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, all machinery underneath the words. Sarah kept her expression neutral. "Dr. Pierce. How can I help you?" "I'm reviewing the protocol modifications on Sergeant Webb's sepsis panel." He held up the chart, her handwriting visible in the margins. "Specifically, your recommendation to adjust the dosage of the vancomycin based on his renal clearance rate." She'd caught his error at 11:38 p.m. the previous night. His order had been 2 grams of vancomycin for every 8 hours, a standard dose for an immunocompromised patient recovering from surgery. Except Webb's creatinine clearance was running at 34 milliliters per minute, which meant his kidneys were operating at roughly one-third capacity. The dose should have been adjusted downward by approximately 60% to account for his reduced clearance. The standard protocol was right there in the Seattle General Formulary, page 147, subsection 4b. She'd written a note on the chart, polite and deferential, suggesting a recalculation. Pierce's eyes were the color of old ice, and they didn't blink. That calculation was correct, Sarah said quietly. I'm not asking if the calculation was correct, Pierce said. He turned the chart so she could see her own handwriting. I'm asking what gave you the authority to second-guess my clinical judgment. You're a registered nurse, not a pharmacist. You're certainly not a physician. The night shift supervisor, Janet, had stopped reviewing admit papers 3 desks away and was now very focused on her computer screen, pretending not to listen. The fluorescent lights buzzed above them in the darkness like insects trapped in plastic. Sarah could hear the faint beep of monitors from the patient rooms, the distant sound of an ambulance siren approaching the emergency department, the soft pad of her own breathing. She said, I apologize, Doctor. I only meant to flag the interaction for review. Flag it. Pierce repeated the word like it tasted like metal. You flagged my clinical judgment. Based on nursing school textbooks and internet research, I assume. Based on protocol, Sarah said. The Seattle General Sepsis Formulary. Which you signed off on when you joined the department 5 years ago. She hadn't meant to add the last part. It just came out measured, factual, without inflection. One measured breath. The kind of thing a person said when they'd been trained to move through dangerous spaces without flinching, when they'd learned that silence was more powerful than noise. Pierce's face went very still. He closed the chart with a deliberate motion, the sound of the spine cracking like a rifle bolt. My office. 6 a.m. Before you leave shift. It wasn't a request. It was a command. His eyes moved past her to Janet, who was suddenly very interested in her coffee mug. And Ms. Chen, if I ever catch you documenting concerns about my orders on a patient's chart again, I will have you removed from this hospital. Do you understand? Sarah met his gaze. She didn't flinch. Yes, Doctor. He left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway toward the on-call room, and the night shift resumed its usual rhythm, the mechanical breathing of ventilators, the 4 pumps chirping their soft alerts, the endless hum of the building's climate control system cycling through another hour. Janet looked at her with something that might have been pity or might have been recognition of a mistake already made. You probably shouldn't have corrected him, Janet said quietly. The patient could have developed vancomycin toxicity, Sarah said. She was already moving on to the next task, updating her notes from her rounds, her hand steady on the keyboard. His creatinine would have climbed another 5 points in 72 hours. I know, Janet said. But Pierce doesn't like to be questioned. Not by anyone. Especially not by, she stopped, didn't finish the sentence. Sarah looked at her. Especially not by women? Especially not by nurses? Especially not by Asian nurses? Especially not by anyone who knows more than he does, Janet said quietly. And he knows that you're smarter than him. That's what he can't stand. Sarah had learned a long time ago that intelligence wasn't the same as safety. It was actually the opposite. The smartest people got assigned the most dangerous missions. The best surgeons got sent to war zones. The ones who asked good questions ended up in places where questions got you killed. She'd asked good questions once. She'd questioned her orders about rotating out of Kandahar after 6 months. She'd questioned whether her replacement was ready. She'd questioned a lot of things, and then 2 people died, her mother and the medic she'd been trying to protect by staying, and she'd learned that some questions got answered in ways that didn't include words. She finished her shift notes at 5:43 a.m. and made a final round on the 3rd floor, checking on Webb, on an elderly woman recovering from cardiac surgery, on a teenager who'd attempted suicide and was sleeping with his mother in the chair beside him. At 5:51 a.m., she touched the folded flag in her locker, 3 times, a ritual older than language, and knocked on the door of Dr. Pierce's office. He was waiting, his desk positioned so the light from his computer reflected off his face in a way that made him look carved from stone. She closed the door behind her quietly and stood at a respectful distance, her posture deferential, her hands clasped in front of her. Everything about her body language said nurse, subordinate, aware of her place, apologetic for existing in his space. Pierce didn't gesture for her to sit. In 16 years of practice, I have never been corrected by nursing staff on a protocol decision. Not once. Do you understand what that tells me? Sarah didn't answer. She'd learned that silence was sometimes the answer that didn't give him anything to attack. It tells me that you have crossed a line. His voice was very quiet now, which was worse than when he'd been loud. You have overstepped. And I don't tolerate staff members who think they're above the hierarchy of this hospital. Especially temporary staff. He'd used the word temporary. Sarah noted it, filed it away. He knew she was new. He didn't know why. The next words that came out of her mouth were delivered with the kind of quiet certainty that had kept her alive in Kandahar. I know exactly what my limitations are, doctor. Do you? His face went white. For 3 full seconds, neither of them moved. Then he stood up, his hands pressed flat on the desk, and Sarah saw the moment he decided to destroy her. But that decision, that moment of choice, was interrupted by her phone. It buzzed in her pocket with the coded message she'd been waiting for. Intelligence alert. 3 a.m. text from a number that didn't exist. A supply delivery to Seattle General that didn't match any purchase order. Surgical instruments scheduled for arrival in the cardiothoracic wing. Arriving at 9 a.m. this morning. The medical supply diversion ring she'd been hunting for 8 months had just made a move, and it had operational connections to a specific surgeon in this hospital. A surgeon who was friends with Dr. Pierce. A surgeon who might be using wounded soldiers like Sergeant Webb as cover for black market medical equipment. Sarah's phone buzzed again. The message was 3 words, Eagle One. Engage. She looked at Dr. Pierce's face, red now, furious, ready to say the words that would end her employment at Seattle General, and she realized that she'd just made her first mistake in 8 months of invisibility. She'd shown him something he wasn't supposed to see. She'd shown him that she wasn't afraid. The vending machine hummed its mechanical dirge in the basement corridor, fluorescent light pooling around Sarah's shoulders as she fed a dollar bill into the slot. Stale coffee and the chemical ghost of industrial cleaner hung in the air, the smell that meant 2 a.m. at Seattle General, when the world narrowed to monitors and breathing tubes and the particular exhaustion that only 12-hour shifts could carve into bone. She wasn't listening. That was the skill she'd perfected across 18 months in Kandahar and 8 months here in Colorado Springs. The ability to be present without being there, to absorb information while remaining invisible, stone-faced as a monument to competence that no one wanted to see. Dr. Pierce's voice carried down the hallway before his body did. Chen thinks 6 months in some field hospital makes her a surgeon. He was speaking to an intern, a third-year resident named Morrison who looked like he'd never seen blood outside a textbook. Pierce's tone was casual, the way apex predators sound when they're explaining which prey runs slowest. These nurses with hero complexes are a liability. They see one emergency procedure and suddenly they believe they're qualified to override attending physicians. Sarah's hand stilled on the vending machine button. The coffee cup descended with a mechanical click, landing in the tray with the finality of a gavel. The thing about field medicine, Morrison, is it teaches people to improvise. Improvisation is another word for negligence when you're in a proper hospital. Pierce rounded the corner, and Sarah watched his reflection materialize in the vending machine's glass, tailored suit, that particular smile that existed only in the presence of subordinates. Chen's already tried to correct my sepsis protocol twice. Twice. Do you understand what that means? Morrison shook his head, obedient as a retriever. It means she doesn't understand the hierarchy of knowledge in modern medicine. Pierce's voice carried the texture of someone who'd spent 3 decades building walls and had no intention of letting anyone climb them. Nurses aren't physicians. Field medics certainly aren't. There's a reason we have licensing boards, accreditation standards, peer review processes. Sarah turned from the machine. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second, just long enough for Pierce to see that she'd heard every word, just long enough for him to confirm it didn't matter. She moved past them, coffee in hand, her posture unchanged. No flush in her cheeks. No quickening of breath. The same measured pace she'd walked through the aid station in Kandahar when IED shrapnel had torn through the canvas walls and Sergeant Marcus Webb's predecessor had bled out on the surgical table while she applied pressure to a wound the size of a fist. Control wasn't an emotion. Control was a discipline. It was the difference between a soldier and a casualty. But Pierce needed more. Needed the satisfaction of seeing her react. Nurse Chen. His voice took on that particular quality that made even the air seem to obey. Still here? I'm surprised you haven't forgotten your place yet. She stopped. Didn't turn. Waited. Keep crossing lines and I'll have security escort you out personally. Do you understand? His smile was audible in those words, that confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who couldn't afford the consequences. Your credentials are being reviewed. Thoroughly. By people far more qualified than either of us to determine if those field hospital claims on your resume have any validity. Sarah turned. Her eyes found his, and in that moment, just that moment, something flickered across her face. Not fear. Not anger. Something deeper, something that looked like the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying secrets that weighed more than armor. I know exactly what my limitations are, Doctor. Her voice came out level as a pulse oximeter reading. Do you? The corridor stretched between them. Morrison had stopped breathing. Even the vending machine seemed to pause its mechanical hum. Pierce's smile froze. Just for an instant, barely a frame of film. Then it reformed, sharper this time, predatory in a new way. The way a man's smile changes when he realizes he's been challenged by someone he thought was beneath him, and now he has to prove why that was always true. We'll see about that, he said, and walked past her without another word. Sarah didn't move until his footsteps disappeared up the stairwell. Then she continued down the corridor toward the trauma bay, coffee growing cold in her hands, her breathing exactly as controlled as it had been before. The skill of invisibility was knowing how to reassemble yourself the moment the threat passed. No trembling. No breakdown. Just the methodical putting back together of a facade that had been tested and, visibly, held. 2 days later, the review board would be convened. But first, there was the matter of room 347. Sarah knew the patient assignment before she pulled the chart. Night shift meant she pulled her own patients, a privilege earned through 8 months of silent competence and the kind of work ethic that made other nurses grateful when she was scheduled. Room 347 was listed as Marcus Webb, 28-year-old male, bilateral amputation, stable post-op day 4. The name hit her like a physical thing, like standing in the rotor wash of a Black Hawk, the world suddenly moving in only one direction. Webb. Marcus Webb. The medic who'd replaced her in Kandahar when headquarters pulled her stateside for this intelligence operation. The one who'd written her a letter she'd never received, probably lost in the bureaucratic void that swallowed classified communications. The one who'd been in the aid station 6 months after she left, working in the same canvas structure, under the same incoming fire, on the same kind of patient she'd been treating with nothing but a combat knife and a prayer. The aid station had taken an IED blast on a Tuesday in April. 3 KIA. Webb had lost both legs below the knee to a blast radius she could calculate down to the exact meters based on the pattern of destruction in his chart photos. The folder contained the medical summary, the surgical notes from Walter Reed, the discharge paperwork from physical therapy. What it didn't contain was the folded flag from the aid station's lost medic, the teammate who died because he'd been in the wrong place at the exact right moment when the explosion came. The flag was in Sarah's locker, wrapped around a combat knife she'd used in her last field surgery, kept like a relic in a place where no one ever looked. Webb was her responsibility now. Her patient. The universe had a sense of irony that bordered on cruelty. She entered room 347 at 11:02 p.m., chart in hand, prepared to be professional and invisible, and exactly what this patient needed. The monitor's steady beeping filled the darkness: pulse, oxygenation, blood pressure, all the vital signs that translated suffering into numbers. Webb was asleep, his face still carrying the kind of gauntness that came from post-operative recovery and the dawning realization that the world he'd known was no longer the world he inhabited. Sarah ran the assessment with the precision of someone who'd done this thousands of times. Dressing integrity. Phantom pain levels: he'd wake at 2 a.m. with the sensation of feet that no longer existed, a cruel neurological joke the body played on amputees. For placement. Medication schedule. All of it documented with the kind of care that made Dr. Pierce's accusations look like the baseless attacks they were. But when she checked his chart notes, something else caught her attention. A flag in his personnel file. Medical background. Prior service. Unit designation: 75th Ranger Regiment, attached to JSOC Task Force Support. That wasn't coincidence. That wasn't bad luck. That was her handler knowing exactly where to place her, which hospital would have access to the supply diversion ring, which patients would provide her cover story as a competent night shift nurse who just happened to work in trauma. Webb had been the bait. Or the anchor. Or the reason the universe had decided she needed a reminder of exactly what she'd left behind when she'd accepted this assignment. She documented the assessment, her hands moving through the motions while her mind calculated angles and consequences. The medical supply diversion ring was connected to Webb's unit. Someone in the chain of command was selling opioids and surgical equipment to black market buyers. Someone had known about the IED's placement. Someone had needed Webb off the battlefield for reasons that had nothing to do with insurgent activity and everything to do with intelligence that needed to be cleaned up before anyone asked questions. And now he was here. In her hospital. In her care. In the middle of whatever game was being played at a level high enough that military intelligence had embedded her in a civilian institution with a cover story and a classified phone number she could only use in bathrooms with running water to mask the signal. The rain started around midnight, hammering against the hospital windows like it had something to prove. Sarah finished her shift rounds at 3 a.m., every patient stable, every intervention documented, every moment of her competence etched into records that Dr. Pierce was probably reviewing right now with a predator's focus, looking for the inconsistency that would finally justify his instinct that she didn't belong here. Except she did belong. She belonged with the kind of absolute certainty that came from having held dying men's hands and knowing exactly when to cut through muscle tissue and when to apply pressure and when to accept that someone had already bled out and there was nothing left to save but the next patient. The vending machine could wait. The water fountain could wait. Everything could wait except the chart updates and the medication reconciliation and the way her hands moved through each task with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this under far worse conditions than a quiet hospital corridor at 3 in the morning. But when she finally passed room 347 on her way to the nurse's station, Webb was awake. His eyes tracked her with the particular focus of someone who recognized competence the way soldiers recognized weapons, not with fear, but with the understanding that this person knew how to handle things that would destroy most other people. He didn't speak. Neither did she. They just acknowledged each other in that moment, two people who'd survived something that most of Seattle General's staff would never have to understand, and now they were on the same unit, in the same hospital, under the same fluorescent lights that hummed their mechanical monotony while the rain outside tried to wash the world clean. It didn't work. Rain never did. The monitor's rhythm fractured at 2:08 a.m. Sarah heard it before she saw it, that irregular skip in the beeping, the hesitation that meant Marcus Webb's lungs were collapsing on themselves. Room 347. The same bed where he'd been sleeping 4 hours ago, his stumps wrapped in gauze, his chart noting stable vitals and morphine-managed pain. Now his oxygen saturation was dropping like a stone thrown into dark water. 89. 87. 84. She moved before her brain finished processing. Tension pneumothorax. She'd seen this exact presentation 3 times in Kandahar, once in a forward operating base outside Sanjan Valley where the surgical team was pinned down by sniper fire, twice during vehicle extractions when chest wounds didn't manifest until hours later. The air was building in Webb's pleural space, collapsing his lung, crushing his heart against his ribs. In minutes, cardiac arrest. In 5 minutes, death. Sarah's hands were already moving, calling the surgical team. I need an on-call surgeon to room 347. Stat. The night operator's voice came back hollow and distant. Dr. Reeves is 30 miles out. ETA 28 minutes. 28 minutes. Webb's breathing was already laboured, his mouth opening like a fish pulled from water. His oxygen was 79 now. The skin around his ribs was beginning to show the telltale cyanosis, that greyish-purple tinge that meant his cells were starving for oxygen. His remaining leg twitched. Involuntary. Fear response. It's okay, she whispered, checking his pulse. 142. Tachycardic. His blood pressure was holding, but barely. The fear she'd buried for 8 months, the fear of watching someone die because protocol moved slower than physiology, came up like bile and she swallowed it down. The door opened. Dr. Pierce stepped into the room, his phone already in his hand. He was still in scrubs from the evening shift, his stethoscope draped around his neck like a trophy. His expression was the expression of a man holding winning cards. Sarah Chen, he said, not looking at Webb. You're suspended pending investigation. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. She didn't answer. She was checking Webb's chest for breath sounds, left side clear, right side silent. Pneumothorax confirmed. She could feel her own pulse in her fingertips, steady and separate from the panic trying to climb her throat. Did you hear me? Pierce's voice had that edge of satisfaction. The edge of a man who'd finally gotten what he wanted. I heard you. She was reaching for the supplies already, her body operating on 2 years of muscle memory from a place this man would never understand. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Alcohol swab. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line. You can't treat this patient anymore. Pierce was moving toward the bed now, physically positioning himself between Sarah and Webb's chest. I'm calling security. Webb's oxygen was 7-4. Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with the specific terror of not being able to breathe, and something inside her that had been compressed for 8 months snapped clean. Not rage. Clarity. The clarity of a soldier who'd already made decisions that cost people their lives. Who'd learned that hesitation killed faster than any bullet. She pulled her pocket knife from her scrub pocket. The knife was small, worn smooth at the handle from use, and Pierce's face went pale as if she'd pulled a gun. What are you doing? Saving his life, Sarah said. Get out of my way or watch him die. Pierce didn't move. He was reaching for his phone, his thumb already swiping toward his contacts list. His voice had that clinical calm, the calm of a man who was already composing the narrative in his head. Already rehearsing how he described this to the board. You're finished, Chen. You understand that? Finished. She stepped around him like water finding a path around stone. Webb's skin was cool and clammy beneath her gloved hands. She prepped the site with the alcohol swab, felt the anatomical landmarks through her fingers, the second rib, the space beneath it, the precise point where muscle gave way to lung. Her breathing was even. Her hands were steady. The knife was sharp. The needle slipped between his ribs with the smallest resistance, and then the hiss of air escaping. The sound was like a pressure valve opening in a submarine, like the world breathing out. Webb's body jerked, his lungs suddenly able to expand, and Sarah could see it in real time, his oxygen saturation climbing as his body found oxygen again. 74. 78. 82. 87. Pierce was already texting. Sarah could hear his thumbs moving against the screen, rapid and furious. Already typing out the narrative. already constructing his defense. She pulled the needle free and taped it in place, her movements precise and clean, and walked past him to the monitor to check Webb's blood pressure. 110/64. Stable. You just ended your career, Pierce said, and he was leaving now, his phone to his ear before he was even through the doorway. His voice carried down the hallway. Chief of Staff? This is Dr. Pierce. We have a situation with Sarah Chen. Yes, that one. She's just performed an unauthorized invasive procedure using an improvised needle decompression. No surgical authorization, no attending physician supervision. I'm calling the board. This needs immediate action. Sarah watched the monitor, watching the rhythm settle into something coherent, something survivable. Webb's breathing was easing, the panic draining from his face as oxygen finally reached his brain. He looked at her with tears in his eyes, not from pain, but from the specific relief of not being dead. You're going to be okay, she said, and meant it in the way only someone who'd kept someone alive under fire could mean it. You're stable now. She was still checking his full lines, still verifying the needle's placement, when her phone buzzed. A text from the Chief of Staff. Report to my office. Immediately. It was 3:04 a.m. The sunrise came at 5:41 a.m., and with it came a hospital administrator, a security guard, and a letter printed on letterhead that used words like unauthorized, reckless, liability, and immediate suspension pending investigation. They were professional about it. They didn't raise their voices. They simply informed her that she was no longer permitted to treat patients at Seattle General, that her access badge was being deactivated, that security would escort her to her locker and then to the exit. She gathered her things slowly, methodically. A change of clothes. Her phone charger. The small picture of her daughter taped to the inside of her locker door. She didn't look at the folded flag, the memorial from the teammate who died in that same blast that had taken Webb's legs. She couldn't, not here, not with the security guard watching her every movement as if she were a threat. As if saving someone's life had somehow made her dangerous. Dr. Pierce had already called in favors. That was the hospital gossip by the time she walked out into the early morning air. 3 board members had received calls from him before 4 a.m., board members who owed him consultations and gratitude and the kind of political debt that moved faster than official channels. He'd contacted the field hospital listed on her resume, the one that didn't actually exist, the one that was just a phone number that rang through to a CIA liaison in Langley. Military intelligence was receiving inquiries. Questions were being asked about her credentials, her training, her background. Her cover was being torn open. The rain started at 6:15 a.m., a cold spring rain that fell sideways against the parking lot. Sarah sat in her car for exactly 9 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, and didn't cry. The protocol was clear: if her cover was blown, she was to go dark immediately. Withdraw. Regroup. Let the mission die rather than let it expose the network. But Marcus Webb was still alive. Stable. Breathing on his own because she'd made a choice that Pierce had already weaponized into proof of her incompetence. The rain hammered against the windshield like accusations. Like she'd done something wrong for saving a life. Like kindness was a liability in a system that measured success in credentials and board votes and the ability to call in favors at 3 a.m. She pulled out of the parking lot and headed home to her daughter, knowing that everything she'd built was coming down, and knowing that she would do it all again without hesitation. The suspension notice arrived at 4 in the afternoon, and delivered by security to her locker while she was still on the floor. 3 lines of official letterhead. Effective immediately. Pending investigation. Do not remove hospital property. The envelope felt heavier than paper should weigh. Sarah folded it once and placed it in her scrub pocket next to the combat badge she'd kept hidden for 8 months, the one Pierce had seen last week and dismissed as costume jewelry from a medical conference. She finished her shift in silence. Charted her final entries. Helped the night nurse with a blood draw. Nobody asked questions. By the time she clocked out at midnight, the entire hospital already knew the nurse who'd challenged Dr. Pierce was being investigated for falsified credentials. 3 days of suspension felt like 3 months. She didn't leave the house. Didn't answer calls from colleagues. Didn't read the email chain that started circulating, forwarded messages showing Pierce's documentation to the chief of staff, employment discrepancies, a supposed field hospital that supposedly had no records, the suggestion that she'd fabricated her entire overseas background to justify dangerous medical overreach. The narrative was clean. Airtight. A woman with delusions of competence who'd endangered a patient and lied to cover her tracks. The rain came on day 2, hammering the kitchen window like accusations. Sarah sat at the table at 3 in the afternoon while her 7-year-old daughter Emma was still at school, and she held the folded flag in both hands, the one that had come home in a dress uniform she'd never worn, folded by someone else's hands into a triangle someone else's hands could carry. Corporal David Reeves. Her medic. The one who'd taken her place in Kandahar when she'd been pulled for this assignment. The one who'd been in the aid station when the IED came through the roof. The one who came home this way. Mom. Emma stood in the doorway, her backpack sliding off her shoulder. Why are you home? Sarah's hands wouldn't let go of the flag. The fabric was stiff now, practically cardboard, sharp creases that had been folded 1,000 times in her nightmares. She'd kept it in a showbox at the back of her closet, but her hands had found it anyway, pulled it out, unfolded it to its full rectangular shape and then folded it back into a triangle because that was the only way she knew how to hold it. I'm taking some time, Sarah said. Her voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Someone who broke. Someone who bent. Emma dropped her backpack and climbed into her lap, 6 years old, not understanding why Mom's eyes were closed so tight they were shaking. Sarah pressed her face into her daughter's hair and whispered something Emma would never understand. I'm sorry, David. I'm sorry I couldn't stay. I'm sorry they needed me somewhere else and you had to go instead. The whispers kept coming, and they tasted like salt, and her shoulders moved in ways she'd trained herself never to let happen in public. Alone at 3 in the afternoon with her daughter asking why Mommy was sad, Sarah Chen finally broke. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing the mission had failed. 3 months of classified intelligence work, buried under a suspension and an investigation. The medical supply diversion ring she'd been embedded to document, still operating. Still bleeding resources. Still connected to Marcus Webb's missing legs and Reeves's folded flag. All of it compromised because Pierce had made a phone call and discovered that Forward Operating Base Chapman didn't have records of a nurse named Sarah Chen, because Forward Operating Base Chapman didn't exist, because the Pentagon couldn't exactly tell a civilian hospital board that they ran a black site medical intelligence operation. The review board meeting was scheduled for Wednesday at 10 in the morning. Sarah received the notification via email, copied to her personal account. She was required to appear. She was entitled to representation. She was advised of her right to remain silent. The email was very official. Very final. She dressed in civilian clothes, charcoal slacks, a navy blouse, nothing that suggested what she actually was. No scrubs. No ID badge. No armor except the one pinned inside her jacket, her Special Forces tab, small and hard against her ribs. She'd sewn it there in the dark at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, unable to stop her hands from moving. The combat badge came out of her pocket and went into her jacket pocket instead. The folded flag stayed in the car. The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and photocopier toner. 7 board members sat in a neat line behind a long table. Pierce stood beside them, and he was magnificent in his competence. Dangerous that way. He had prepared a presentation, slides showing her supposed field hospital assignment that didn't exist, employment gaps he'd framed as suspicious, the needle decompression procedure she'd performed with a pocket knife and a stainless steel blade, which he'd labeled in his presentation as reckless cowboy medicine performed by an unlicensed individual in a trauma setting. The evidence, Pierce said, and his voice moved through the room like a surgeon's hands through a sternum, indicates a pattern of deception beginning from her initial hiring and escalating to last week's dangerous intervention that could have killed Sergeant Webb. I contacted Forward Operating Base Chapman directly. No Sarah Chen. No nursing roster matching her dates. I then contacted 3 medical credentialing services. No military records. No certifications. I believe she fabricated her entire background to justify practicing medicine without a license. He smiled at the board. Criminal charges are warranted. Sarah sat in a chair positioned like a defendant's seat, and she used her breathing, the one she'd learned in selection training, the one that fit between heartbeats, the one that made her invisible. Breathe in for 4 counts. Hold for 7. Out for 8. The trembling was restraint. The stillness was rage. The silence was a choice. A board member raised his hand. Ms. Chen, do you have a response? Sarah opened her mouth to speak, and that's when the conference room door opened. The wheelchair came in backward first, pushed by a hospital orderly. Sergeant Marcus Webb's face was the color of seafoam, his forepaw rattling with the motion, sweat beading at his temples. He had no business being out of bed. He had no business being conscious. Frankly, his medication was heavy enough to keep him sedated, reduce the phantom pain, let him sleep between surgeries. But his eyes were locked on Sarah's, and they were sharper than any blade. Webb, the attending said, standing. You need to return to your room immediately. Webb ignored him. Reaper 6, he said. His voice came out like gravel in a metal drum, barely above a whisper but cutting straight through Pierce's presentation, through the board's confusion, through every official protocol designed to protect a hospital's institutional authority. That's what we called her. Reaper 6. Pierce frowned. Sergeant, you're post-operative. Medication can cause confusion. Not confused. Webb's hands gripped the wheelchair arms, and Sarah could see the shake in his knuckles, the effort it took to speak. She pulled 2 IEDs out of Helmand Province roads before they detonated. She performed 17 field surgeries in an aid station with no running water. I watched her save my entire unit. Watched her get pulled for this assignment 3 weeks before the blast. His eyes found Sarah's again. She's the reason I'm alive to be missing my legs. The room went quiet in a way that made the air feel solid. A Marine colonel stood abruptly from the gallery. Hospital security, Sarah realized, not security. His phone was in his hand, and he was reading from it before anyone could speak. Captain Sarah Chen. United States Army Special Forces. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. Combat Medical Badge. Forward Operating Base Chapman, Kandahar Province, 2019. 17 combat surgeries performed in austere conditions. Multiple life-saving interventions under direct fire. Recommended for promotion to Major. Classified Medical Intelligence Assignment, Seattle General, 6 months duration. He lowered the phone and looked directly at the board. Everything she put on her application was true. Everything. Pierce was standing now. His hand moved toward the presentation remote, as if he could click back to his evidence, rewind this moment. This is irrelevant. I don't care what medals she. The conference room door opened again, and the room's oxygen seemed to shift. A 2-star general entered in dress uniform, his chest a constellation of ribbons, he's bearing the kind that made gravity itself adjust. He didn't acknowledge the board. He looked at Sarah, who was still seated, still composed, her breathing still locked at 4-7-8 counts. And then she moved her hand to her jacket and unpinned the combat badge. Unpinned the Special Forces tab. Let them fall in her lap, small and hard and absolutely lethal in their silence. The general saluted her. A full formal salute, arms straight, held for 3 seconds. When he lowered his hand, his voice was quiet. Captain Chen. Thank you for your service. Pierce back toward the door. I don't understand what's happening here. Dr. Pierce, the general said, and his voice moved through the room like winter. You contacted a classified military facility and compromised an active intelligence operation. You accessed her classified personnel file without authorization. Federal agents are in the lobby. You're under arrest. A marine IT specialist approached the board with a hard drive, and he was talking about recovered footage, about deletion attempts at 11:27 p.m. the night before, about evidence tampering and falsified incident reports. Pierce was through the door by the time the words finished landing. Sarah looked at the folded combat badge in her palm, then up at the general. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave, and it carried the weight of someone who'd stopped pretending. The mission, sir. The supply diversion ring. The investigation. Still operational, the general said. Which is why you're being reinstated effective immediately. Cleared for medical practice. Redeployed to finish what you started. He paused. Your daughter is going to be proud of you. Even if she doesn't understand why yet. Sarah nodded once. That was enough. The doors to the conference room opened. Webb rolled through them in a wheelchair, his physical therapist gripping the handles, shaking her head at the medical staff who'd advised against it. His face was grey with effort, but his eyes were locked on Sarah's with the kind of recognition that only comes from shared foxholes and blood-soaked sand. Reaper 6, he whispered. Just 2 words. Just a call sign. But the entire room went silent as if someone had cut the power to the building. Sarah's breath caught. Not visibly. Not in a way anyone watching would have noticed. But Webb saw it. He always could read her. In Kandahar, he'd known when she was running on fumes before she did. He'd known when she was about to break before she knew it herself. And he knew now that his 2 words had just cracked open every locked door she'd built in 8 months of being invisible. A Marine colonel stood abruptly from the gallery, his dress blues sharp enough to cut. His phone was in his hand, screen raised toward the board. His voice carried the weight of 23 years in uniform. Captain Sarah Chen. United States Army Special Forces. Citation reads as follows: Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart. For actions conducted in Kandahar province where she performed 17 field surgeries under fire. He paused, letting the weight of that number settle into the room like artillery rounds. 17. Without anesthesia beyond what she could carry in her ruck. Without backup beyond her training and her will. Without any guarantee she'd survive the next mortar round. Dr. Pierce's face drained of color. The arrogance that had sustained him for 40 years seemed to drain out through his shoes. The conference room door opened again. This time it wasn't a medical administrator or a board member. It was a 2-star general. Not flanked by aides. Not preceded by announcements. Just a woman in dress uniform whose presence made the air pressure change, made everyone's spine straighten involuntarily. She moved through the room like someone accustomed to having gravity rearrange itself around her. She walked directly to Sarah. And she saluted. Not a casual gesture. Not a social courtesy. A full military salute, crisp, formal, the kind reserved for commanding officers and fallen soldiers. She held it for 3 seconds, then dropped her hand and extended it in a handshake that was absolutely not asking permission. Captain Chen. It's an honor. Then she turned to face the board, and her voice became the temperature of a winter morning in the mountains. Dr. Pierce, I assume. Let me be clear about what you've done. Captain Chen was placed at Seattle General by military intelligence to investigate a medical supply diversion ring operating through this hospital's pharmacy. The ring was moving controlled pharmaceuticals to contractors with ties to insurgent operations in 3 provinces. Millions of dollars. Dozens of lives lost. Captain Chen was 6 weeks from identifying the entire network when you filed your credentials complaint. A federal agent entered from the side door. Then another. Then a third. They moved with the fluid precision of people trained to occupy space without announcing themselves, their badges visible, their purpose unmistakable. Dr. Marcus Pierce, one of them said, stepping forward. We need to ask you some questions about your contact with a CIA facility in Virginia listed on this employee's resume. Pierce's mouth opened. Closed. His lawyer wasn't present. His network of board members suddenly looked very interested in the conference room table. The general continued. Your interference with Captain Chen's assignment has exposed years of investigation. Your actions nearly killed our only witness to the supply chain operation. Your actions also violated multiple federal statutes regarding intelligence operations and witness protection. She paused. Let that sink in. The question is whether your interference was coincidental incompetence or something more deliberate. That's when the hospital's IT specialist walked in. Marine tattoo on his forearm. Name badge reading Clayton, Systems Administration. He carried a hard drive like it was a precision instrument, because it was. Conference Room B, he said quietly, and suddenly the display screen on the wall flickered to life. Footage. Crystal clear. Security camera from the medical records room. Date stamp, 2 weeks before Webb's crisis. Dr. Pierce, his ID badge visible, accessing Sarah's personnel file. His hand scrolling through restricted medical documentation. His expression focused, purposeful, methodical. Not curiosity. Not carelessness. Deliberation. Then, parking garage footage. Midnight. Pierce meeting a woman in a dark suit. The exchange was subtle, an envelope passed from her hands to his. The woman's face became clear on the second playback. Webb's voice cut through the silence. Barely above a whisper, but everyone heard it. That's her. The pharmaceutical contractor. She was at FOB Shank the week before the IED attack. She was in the supply tent where I kept my morphine stores. Where I restocked the field kits. He turned his wheelchair slightly to face Pierce directly. The week before someone sold our location to a Taliban asset for $50,000. The room didn't just go quiet. The room stopped existing. There was only breath and heartbeat and the understanding that the board was looking at more than a credentials violation. They were looking at a man who wasn't just targeting a nurse from ego. He was protecting a supply chain that had killed soldiers. That had killed Webb's legs and his brothers. Pierce stood up. Someone reached for him. A federal agent moved with the economy of motion that meant they'd done this before, and Pierce's escape plan, whatever it was, evaporated before it could fully form. You have the right to remain silent, one of the agents began, and Pierce's mouth worked soundlessly, his decades of authority dissolving in real time like sugar in water. Clayton, the Marine IT specialist, stepped forward with the rest of the evidence. Financial records preserved. Metadata showing when Pierce had attempted to delete files, not once, but 8 separate times, each attempt timestamped, each one proving intent. His attempt to contaminate Sarah's incident reports from the needle decompression, changing clinical notes, altering medication documentation. Every keystroke logged. Every action preserved by someone who'd learned that digital evidence was the modern equivalent of casings at a crime scene. We have you on 12 counts, the federal agent said to Pierce. Evidence tampering. Insurance fraud. Conspiracy related to contraband pharmaceutical distribution. Conspiracy related to aiding and abetting operations that resulted in loss of life to military personnel. He paused. You're going to want that lawyer now, Dr. Pierce. You're going to want several. They led Pierce out of the conference room. His hands were not restrained, not yet, but the way the agents flanked him made it clear that the choice to walk or be carried was the only autonomy he had left. The general turned to Sarah. Your mission isn't over. Not yet. But as of right now, your cover is no longer a necessity. We need you to complete the final 3 names on the supply network. You'll have federal support. You'll have military backup. She extended a folder. And you'll have your rank back. Captain. Sarah took the folder. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the timbre of someone who'd been conducting surgical procedures in firefights, who'd made life-and-death decisions without hesitation, who'd buried her own trauma under 8 months of silence. Yes. Webb rolled his wheelchair closer to Sarah's chair. His physical therapist had stepped back, understanding this was not a medical moment but something deeper. Something that existed in the space between soldiers who'd seen the worst of each other and the world and come out still breathing. Reaper 6 coming back to the fight, he asked, and the ghost of a smile crossed his scarred face. Different kind of fight now, Sarah said quietly. But yes. 2 weeks later, Pierce's medical license was suspended pending criminal investigation. Within a month, federal charges were filed. Within 6 months, after his public defender negotiated desperately against surveillance footage, financial records, and testimony from a Purple Heart-decorated witness, his license was permanently revoked. The hospital settled a civil suit. The board issued a formal apology. And Dr. Marcus Pierce, who'd spent 40 years climbing the ladder of medical hierarchy, was teaching CPR to high school students at Colorado Springs Community College for $12 an hour, his phone no longer ringing with colleagues, his reputation folded into history like an old newspaper. Sarah returned to night shifts at Seattle General. The supply ring was broken by federal agents using her intelligence. 3 hospital administrators were arrested. 2 pharmaceutical contractors faced federal charges. The diversion operation that had funded insurgent attacks across 3 provinces was dismantled. She kept Webb's Purple Heart citation in her pocket next to the folded flag. Both reminders that some people earned their authority in ways a credential could never measure. Both proof that the quiet ones, the ones who worked without seeking recognition, the ones who bled silently and kept standing, they were the ones who changed the world. The new trauma chief called her into his office one afternoon. Not with the tone Pierce had used. With respect. With something close to awe. "Captain Chen," he said, and she heard herself flinch slightly at the title, the first time she'd heard it spoken in a hospital in 8 months. "We'd like you to lead a training program on emergency field procedures for our residents. We have younger nurses and doctors who need to understand what you know. How you operate. How you make those decisions under pressure." Sarah considered this. Her hand moved to the combat badge on her uniform, the one that Pierce had once dismissed as costume jewelry. "I'll do it," she said. "But they need to understand something first. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. Everything else is just noise." The trauma chief nodded slowly, understanding that he'd just received a lesson that no textbook could teach. If you found this story of resilience, sacrifice, and vindication powerful, please subscribe to this channel and like this video. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by a boss or coworker who didn't know your true value? And if you know a nurse or medical professional serving silently in their community, share their story. The ones who've seen the worst are often the ones who give the most.